All right, I think our participant list is starting to level out there. I just wanted to give everyone a second to join our call. Um, my name is Matt Bucknor, and I want to welcome everyone who's taken a few minutes out of their day today to think about their emotional health and well-being. I'm so grateful for all of you. It's going to be, I think, over 100 after all the participants joined today who have taken a few minutes to make time for yourselves and think about approaches to your own emotional health and well-being in these really difficult times. I know that so many of us are really busy coming up with new policies and new procedures, new ways of taking care of patients and new ways of supporting our colleagues and our learners in our department, but it's just so incredibly important that we take some time to think about our own emotional health and well-being so we can bring our full selves and be able to support each other as best we can. I feel very confident that you're going to walk away from this session with a few new tools and a few resources to be more intentional about your approach to your own well-being, your own emotional health. I think that oftentimes this gets left to the end of the laundry list of things to do on a daily basis. And so it's great in the middle of the day to just take a moment and think about ways that we can be more intentional about our approach to these really critically important topics. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel Dominguez Moncada, who's going to introduce the two speakers we're really lucky to have today, Drs. Allenson and Dr. Parker.
Thank you, Dr. Buckner. And hello, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful session that we put together for you. It's been a pleasure to partner with Dr. Buckner, and I'm going to be very quick because I want to get right to the show. We have wonderful, wonderful opportunity. I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Andrew Parker, who's been with the university for 20 years, helping us with all of our counseling services that we need, and that's for both staff and faculty. Additionally, joining us today is Dr. Jessica Allenson, and Dr. Allenson joins us as well, and she has over 10 years in the mental health services field. So we are thrilled to have both of them as our guest speakers for you today. Just a little bit of logistics. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. You'll be able to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll collect those questions, and hopefully at the end of the session, we'll have an opportunity to shout out maybe just a few of those questions and have all of our doctors, Dr. Buckner, Allenson, and Parker answer them for you. Additionally, these resources that you're about to see, about to view, are going to be available after this webinar. And then finally, this webinar is being recorded for those who could not attend. With that, I'll turn it over and we'll get started with Dr. Andrew Parker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Daniel. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to be brief myself. One thing I wanted to say, first of all, about FSAP services for all of you who are aware of it and those of you who may not, is that FSAP is fully operational now on a remote basis. That means that we are still there to meet all of your counseling needs, whether personal or work-related. And we are also there for those of you in managerial and supervisory positions if you need organizational consultations of any kind. So just be aware that we are fully up and running and there to serve you. Now, before I turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Allenson, I just want to say that what we are going to be presenting to you is a very packed set of information that we have collated and curated for you, so that this is going to be like a lot of really useful how-to information that we hope you'll find very useful. And so we're going to be moving through it fairly quickly because it is a lot of information. So please, though, if you do have questions, as Daniel mentioned, go ahead and submit those, and we'll try to get to as many of them at the end as we can. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Allenson, who's going to walk us through these slides. Jessica?
All right, thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. As Dr. Parker says, there is a lot in this material today to cover, and that's why we are going to make everything available. But I would like to walk us through it slowly with the idea that there is a lot of types of experiences and reactions that people are having. So we did try to create more of a global perspective than a micro perspective on self-care in this presentation. So if we could start with the next slide, please. Can we get the next slide? Thank you. The objectives today are to address our current sources of distress. We're also going to be reviewing tools and recommendations for practical wellness, things that are very tangible and concrete. And then we'll shift into talking a little bit about tools and recommendations for addressing emotional wellness. We are going to explore some common pitfalls that happen with self-care, especially when we're trying a new self-care routine. And we're going to be identifying very distinct and particular resources for emotional support during the outbreak. That will be at UCSF, at our program at FSAP, and also in our community. The last thing that I'm going to invite everyone to do today is actually commit to some personal wellness goals. And after this presentation, Daniel's going to help me by sending out some flyers for you, which include a resource guide, but they also are going to include a self-care plan that you can fill out yourself. So next slide, please. Okay. I'm hoping everybody can see this. There we go. Before we start off, I really just want to acknowledge that today is not necessarily going to resolve or reconcile all concerns. It's not to stop our fears or our experiences from coming up, and it's not to provide a panacea for all of our experiences, but instead I'd like to invite us today to really acknowledge what's going on, why today, why this time feels so difficult, what the reality is of living and working during a global pandemic, what that looks like. I would also like you to consider what you do have control over in your current circumstance, instead of focusing on the things that we really cannot control right now, and really consider what tools that we talk about today that could improve your daily or weekly lives. I'd like to consider how we can best support one another. I think the fact that this team put together such a wonderful presentation speaks volumes about this department and your dedication to each other's well-being. But I also think experiencing the common humanity of what this pandemic feels like, even in a Zoom session like this, is important. I think it allows us to come together and spend time in a space that is dedicated, as Dr. Bucknor said, to really taking care of ourselves, even if that's not always the first thing on our list. Next slide, please. So the kinds of stresses that most of us are experiencing right now, to me, can be broken down in a couple of different ways. And when we were putting together this presentation, we were looking for more thematic. You know, the first thing that's really important in this unprecedented time is uncertainty. And personally, that might look like financial uncertainty. It might look like health and well-being uncertainty. Professionally, it might mean that you're not sure what your next week or month is going to look like. It might mean that you're not sure how to treat or care for patients. You might be in a new role, or you might be wearing more hats than you're used to wearing. On a global perspective, a lot of us are waiting on a daily news to tell us what our lives are going to look like. And I know recently we were just asked to expand our shelter in place. So there is an amount of our lives that are not in our control right now, and that leads to a strong feeling of underlying uncertainty. I think the next thematic experience that a lot of us are having is a sense of overwhelm. The new responsibilities that we're being asked to juggle, including telecommuting, presenting to a few hundred people online, potentially you're a parent, you're a caregiver, but you're also in your work role. You're juggling what it's like to be in a home space while doing professional duties, or you have to leave your house as an essential worker. What does that look like, and what does that feel like? I think feelings of helplessness are very normal in these circumstances. There's not really one thing that all of us can do to help or fix or resolve what's happening right now. So when we're talking about overwhelm, it's not just the sense of concrete overwhelm, but also an experience of emotional and mental. Perhaps access to information feels like it's too much. Maybe you're reading more news than you're used to, or maybe you're reading too little. It's too much to actually access it. But I think the idea right now is that overwhelm is a theme that a lot of us are experiencing. The final theme I wanted to talk about was grief. There's actually a beautiful article written in the Harvard Business Review, and it's an interview with David Kessler, who was one of the folks who helped Elizabeth Kubler-Ross write about the 5 stages of grief. And the interview talks about this experience of an outbreak as a pandemic, of what it means to really grieve our routine, grieve normalcy, grieve a future. It talks about everything from economic grief to individual grief. And I think it's a really beautiful way of exploring what we are all holding right now, which is a sadness for what we're living through, this historical event. Next slide, please. I think it's important to consider really what the goal of self-care is during these times. And I think essentially what we're talking about is managing stress, managing our reaction to the themes that I was just talking about. The goals of managing stress is to acknowledge and sort of invite our uncomfortable emotions, not necessarily to deny them or fix them or again resolve them. Instead, I'd like us to stay curious about the source of our experiences. For some of us, this is not just unprecedented, but confusing. It might also feel like we aren't sure where the source of the confusion or stress is coming from on a minute-to-minute basis. So instead, what we want to focus on is identifying what we can change, what we can actually shift in our lives to feel more comfortable, and be really honest and realistic about what we can't, so that we don't waste time or energy or emotional space on things that are out of our control. We want to find ways to adapt and feel flexible in chaos, which means that we might put a plan in place and have to let it go almost immediately. It might mean that we get a chance to exercise a little bit more of our flexibility rather than our perfectionism during this time. The goal of managing stress is also to help us make conscious choices, ideally staying in our values with compassion for ourselves and others. You know, we don't want to be shifting into this place of reaction, of just immediately responding to what's stressing us out, but instead staying more in our conscious and focused minds. The last goal of stress or managing stress is really wanting to maintain long-term mental and physical well-being. This is more of a marathon. I'm sure people are tired of hearing this. This is more of a marathon than a sprint. So what I'd like to focus on today and what this presentation is about is creating long-term patterns that we can put into place now, which may need to stay in place longer than the initial reaction to the pandemic. It means that we're going to start to put things into place to help us feel comfortable and confident moving forward. Next slide, please. So I thought it might be nice to start off with talking about practical wellness today. Practical wellness essentially means the things we can touch, the things we can organize, the things that really create routine and safety around us. They're very tangible, and they might feel maybe silly, or it might feel like not enough in the face of what's happening. But I think they actually create a very strong and very important piece of our lives, which is really safety and comfort. So the first thing I want to talk about is creating a new routine. Most of us have had to shift pretty dramatically in what our day-to-day looks like, meaning that either you're working from home, or if you are going into an office or a hospital, your commute might look very different right now. I think in these times of change and adaptation, it's really important that we continue to schedule in as much as possible moments for relaxation, times for movement or exercise, ensuring that we're prioritizing connection, not just productivity, but also connection to ourselves, to our family. It might feel a little bit silly to schedule things like movement or relaxation, but a lot of times when a dramatic shift or transition happens, we just start responding. And that response becomes our habit. And that habit might not have included things like conscious connection, relaxation, or exercise. So we want to stay realistic, especially if you're in a home with kids, right? Or you're sharing space or your work routine is changing weekly. But you do want to maintain your routine as much as possible, as much as your schedule really allows for that to become a practice. I think, humans are a creature of habit because it promotes a sense of predictability. And that feels good. It feels good to know what's coming next, especially when there's so much of our world that is not predictable right now. The next point I want to make about practical wellness is setting achievable goals. And I think setting realistic and specific goals that we can achieve throughout our day or our week can provide us a very grounding experience in such ungrounded times. And things like physical goals, like a cleaning chore or laundry, or a mental challenge like a puzzle or a work project, can really help us feel a sense of accomplishment or achievement. I think when we start to lose these normal connections to maybe our coworkers or work projects or meetings, we start to lose this very tangential experience of time passing successfully. So these are little ways we can create this or recreate this in our new space. Thinking about how you best function on a day-to-day basis is going to be important for how you try to recreate that now. For example, I tend to be somebody very visual. So for me, it's really important that I maintain cleanliness in my space. Is it going to be constant every moment? No. But if I set that goal at the end of every other day, I feel a sense of relaxation and accomplishment. Speaking of space, rearranging space is going to be pretty important right now. I'm sure a lot of us have had to adapt quickly, set up our offices where and when we can. I think especially now that we've been asked to shelter in place for quite a bit longer, really consider how disorienting this type of quarantining can be. And maybe consider consciously rearranging your space for more long-term comfort and functionality. This means that if you set up an office space very quickly, some of us had about 24 to 48 hours to get that going, give it a second look. Consider if there is something you can bring in or shift to make it more comfortable for the long term for you. I do recommend, if this is an option, considering making your weekend space different from your day off space, from your weekday or working space, meaning that you may put a monitor towards the back of your desk once your weekend starts. Maybe your desk chair moves to a different side of the room, or if you're homeschooling with your kids, some of their learning materials might get put away just for a few hours or a few days. The idea is that you're creating visual indicators of different time and space, so you don't feel like you're constantly experiencing work or school or multiple hats or roles, but instead you're giving yourself permission visually and literally to take time and space for yourself away from work or school, things like that. Next slide, please. So talking about practical wellness had a lot more to do with our space and our time and the way that we are organizing our days. Shifting into talking about emotional wellness has a lot more to do with our introspective experience and the way that we are experiencing our world right now. The things that I'm talking about here have a lot more to do with what we accept and allow ourselves to feel, rather than trying to control or tamp down or deny that we are having these experiences. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is self-compassion. The definition of compassion is the joining of suffering, to welcome it in, to have this idea that life is going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. So joining with experience of suffering or discomfort while still offering ourselves love and kindness is a very important part in mentally and emotionally thriving during times like this. Things like common humanity, the experience of others feeling what we feel, especially in times of difficulty, helps us stay connected, especially when we're not able to access the normal types of connections that we have on a day-to-day basis. The break room, even outside in the world, a lot of us are sort of moving around and near each other without actually getting that feeling of connection. So under times of stress, it's important that we offer kindness to ourselves, especially being imperfect, especially being unable to do what we normally do to feel well, to feel good. And I think it's important to offer that to others. I think I've been out in the world very little, but there is a sense of tension and fear. And to sort of remember this underlying current of common existence, common concern is present. I think a lot of us have heard about the wonderful efforts that folks at UCSF are making, including taking donations, projects like this, having training seminars. I think it's important to remember that people are out there in a space of compassion and not just in a space of fear, protection, or toilet paper hoarding, whatever might be your experience right now. The next thing I want to discuss around grief is how we allow for non-cyclical experience. I think most of us are pretty familiar with the first 5 stages, but if you're not, they're anger, depression, bargaining, denial, and acceptance. More recently, David Kessler had a discussion with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and asked her to include meaning making as a part of grief. Because really what grief is, it's a letting go of something that doesn't exist anymore and might not exist again. And a lot of us, I think, are grieving normalcy. We're grieving expectations or plans that we had. And I think the experience of common humanity going through a massive grieving process is important to acknowledge. We're all grieving maybe in our homes or in our own ways, but we're all in a space of letting go. I think meaning making is a really beautiful addition to the 5 stages because it offers us a future in which this grief carries us forward. It offers us something. It's emotion not had in vain. So when you consider that grief isn't a linear process, we don't start at anger and end in meaning making, but instead that it comes and goes in waves. I really encourage you to allow yourself to experience all 6 of these and more as we go through the next few weeks, months, and honestly years. The final point that I'd like to bring up today about emotional wellness is mindfulness. I'm sure it's a term that a lot of folks have heard out in their community or potentially just in the world in general. But at its essence, it's the idea that we can create non-judgmental awareness of our inner experience, which is a simple sentence and an incredibly complex practice, but it doesn't have to be. A lot of the resources that Dr. Parker and I are going to be recommending today are based in mindfulness. They're based in an idea that you can use this time to tap into what you need, how you're feeling, and really respond consciously, mindfully to your own emotional needs. So things like guided meditations, exploring readings, and maybe some theory, if that's the way you like to take in new information. But most of this doesn't have to be a 20-minute seated practice every day. Really what I'm thinking about is things like 3 to 5 minute mindful moments, things that you can do right before a meeting or potentially right before you jump into a new school project with one of your kids. Really trying these tiny moments of self-reflection to reconnect before you jump into the next adventure on your day-to-day quarantined life. So today we thought it might be helpful, rather than just maybe talking about this stuff in theory, to do a 3 to 5 minute mindful moment here live in the middle of this meeting. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The mindful moment that we chose for today's training is called the 5 senses mindful moment, which is fairly self-explanatory. Essentially, it is a grounding technique that invites you to use all 5 of your senses to bring yourself back into a space of presence and awareness. I think a lot of us who have ever struggled with anxiety, even jitters, especially now, feelings of restlessness, it might be difficult to feel like you can really be present and conscious in your space and in your body. So what I'm going to do is actually walk us through this mindful moment. And as much as you are comfortable and able, I encourage you to follow along with what is essentially a guided practice of this meditation. So the way that you start this practice is that you allow your body to relax and get supported in whatever seated position that you're in, and get into a comfortable position. I'm going to ask that you bring your attention to your breath, but I don't want you to think about changing it or altering it. And for this exercise, I'm going to invite you to keep your eyes open. And I'd like you to start breathing in and out slowly and naturally. And as you take a minute to get comfortable in your seat and continue to breathe slowly and deeply, I'm going to ask you to tune in to what you can hear around you, maybe starting with the sound of my voice. You're not going to judge the sound or classify them. It's not positive or negative. You're just noticing what you can hear. If you're having difficulty focusing on a particular sound, or your mind starts to wander away, bring your attention back to the sound of your breath in your body. And as you allow your attention to focus on the sound of my voice, or the sounds in your home, or the sounds of outside, I'd just like you to name them as they arise. I'm now going to invite you to bring your attention away from the sounds, but to your sense of smell. What different scents can you pick up in your environment? Maybe you're at home and you can smell food that is cooking or that was recently eaten. Maybe you can smell products around your house that you've used, like your shampoo or a fabric softener. Just take a moment and see what you can smell around you. And again, the goal was not to classify into categories of good or bad, but instead, notice what you can notice through the power of your attention to sense. I'm going to invite you to shift to what you can see. And you might have naturally closed your eyes during the first 2 senses, which is fine. But I'm going to have you open them so you can shift your attention to your surroundings. And I'd like you to look around and take in the finer details of your space. What can you see in the room that you're in? What colors are present? And what shapes are there? Are there dominant shades in the room? Maybe the colors are warm or cool. Allow these objects, these visuals, to ground you in your space, in your body, reducing any other sensations of discomfort that might be present, like restlessness or anxiety. Now we are going to shift to the taste sense. This might sound a little bit odd if you don't have something to eat or drink in front of you, but instead I'm going to ask you to focus on the sensations in your mouth. Maybe how your tongue feels resting between your teeth, or what tastes, if any, are still remaining from a previous meal or sip of coffee. What is the texture in your mouth like? Allow your attention to be fully present on the experience of your mouth and taste. Finally, I invite you to bring your attention to our sense of touch. What can you feel under your hands? Maybe the roughness of jeans or pants, the warmth of bare skin, or the softness of a cotton shirt. Consider not just focusing on your hands, but about what is under your feet and where your body is sitting. Notice all of the textures that you can experience without moving. And scan for places in your body that might feel tense or relaxed. As we bring this mindful moment to a close, I invite you to bring your attention back to this presentation in front of you, allowing your sense of calm, attention, grounded relaxation to stay with you for the rest of this presentation and for the rest of today. These kind of mindful moments are pretty impactful. My hope is that even in that short amount of time, you could notice a shift in your attention, maybe your body, maybe the way that you're taking in information. I really encourage folks to consider what kind of mindful moments work best for you. There are some really beautiful meditations that can be done while walking. And some of the resources that we'll be sending out after this presentation include a number of audio guided meditations. And I'd really encourage folks to check out a number of them to see what feels most comfortable for you. Understanding that some are longer, like 25 minutes, and some like this can be done in 5. Next slide, please. As we mentioned earlier, we are going through quite a bit of material very quickly, and some of this, I expect even most of this for folks, could be a reminder of how to take care of ourselves during times of uncertainty, overwhelm, or grief. But it does feel important to talk about some very easy pitfalls of self-care. And the first one of those is reacting to chaos with chaos. What we mean by that is sometimes it can be easy to respond quickly when transitions happen fast. It means that we often respond without true intention or long-term thought, like setting up a home office in 24 hours. So instead, I invite you, in making a self-care plan, to consider doing this when you feel a little bit more relaxed, maybe at the beginning or end of your day, and taking a breath before you respond to the stressors that you're experiencing. I understand that's easier said than done. Maybe even taking a mindful moment before settling down to create a plan could help the experience feel a little bit more grounded. The self-care plan that we'll be sending out after this also provides a little bit more structure so that your plan is certain to include a little bit of everything. The next pitfall that I think is easy to fall into, especially when we're used to being at the top of our game, is expecting perfection, even when we're trying to take care of ourselves. I think this can look like assuming as soon as we make a wonderful schedule and self-care plan, we're going to follow it every day to a T. And instead, I'd like to invite you to think about embracing imperfection and prioritize flexibility and adaptability above all else. If your self-care plan can only be used 2 times a week, consider what sorts of things need to be on top of your list, and really allowing yourself to go to sleep every night knowing you just did the best that you could. I think making a plan is a wonderful commitment, but holding ourselves to that plan too tightly starts to have a diminishing return when it comes to emotional well-being. The next pitfall that I feel like a lot of us are probably doing these days is taking others' inventory. And that terminology means that you're taking stock of somebody else's experience and comparing your own. I think a lot of us in a situation like a global pandemic, and in a hospital setting especially, wonder if we're doing as much as the person next to us, or the person that we're supporting, or the person that's supporting us. I'd be cautious about thinking that in some way, shape, or form, your contribution is less or even more than somebody else's. And instead, bringing your attention, bringing your affection, bringing your planning back to you and your family's needs in any given moment. I think comparison right now is an easy way to get stuck in a trap of not feeling like enough. And I think in terms of well-being, that trap is uncomfortable and usually untruthful, if I'm honest. So consider not comparing what you're doing or how you're caring for yourself with somebody else, but instead focus on what you need and be honest about that. The last pitfall I'd like to discuss is hoping for immediate lasting results. This, I think, mixes in neatly with perfection, but I think it's the idea that as soon as we get our home office in order or we get our self-care plan in order, that we will immediately feel better. Like the cycle of grief, I think we have to expect that there is not a all or nothing response to something like the COVID-19 outbreak. There is no solution that is going to make us feel better. Instead, we're going to be responding to this as a lifestyle change. We're going back to that idea of this being a marathon and not a sprint. We'll rest when we can, we'll hydrate and fuel when we can, and then we'll keep going. Be conscious of not expecting too much of yourself and of others right now when it comes to consistency or lasting results, but instead experience this as more of a lifestyle change or adaptation. Next slide, please. So we wanted to be sure that folks were really conscious about what is out there in terms of support. I've spent quite a bit of time today talking about how to care for yourself and your home and your family, but I really want to make sure that people know that they're not in this alone. I think Dr. Parker really said it beautifully, that we are we're here, we've been here. Faculty and Staff Assistance Program, exists to make sure that UCSF runs smoothly and that it is a healthy institution, and that starts with individuals. The Faculty and Staff Program, as you can see on the left, is providing virtual individual sessions. We also help with navigating community resources. That means if you're looking to start long-term therapy through your insurance, or you need help finding a psychiatrist or medication management, we can make that process feel a little bit more accessible. The last thing we offer, as I think all of you are currently experiencing, is group debriefings and trainings. So it doesn't just have to be individuals, right? The UCSF resources that are listed here are just sort of a small snippet of what's out there, but Spiritual Care Services is still open and providing services, I believe, both in person and virtually. Caring for the Caregiver is a really wonderful group that offers both peer support and virtual support for folks in the caregiving, so basically the medical side of things. The last thing that has been put together, and I believe is still being updated pretty regularly, is the UCSF Emotional Health and Wellbeing Resources website. And this actually details more about how to utilize spiritual care, caring for the caregivers, and the Faculty and Staff Assistance Program. All of these websites, by the way, are going to be in that resource sheet as well. So I hope no one's frantically scribbling down anything. The last column here that we put together was really trying to detail what's out in the community. So many folks that are in private practice as therapists are offering virtual support. And even if you've never met with the person, they are starting with video or phone sessions. And then as things settle down, you can go back to seeing them in person. A lot of sliding scale clinics are doing the same. Many folks are using virtual means to see friends and family. Zoom dates and happy hours and sort of collective meetings are a great way to make sure that you're scheduling in connection. And I really encourage you not to doubt it before you try it, if you will. I think for some of us, we'll take some new experiences to try to get that need for connection met. A lot of departments are doing meetings via Zoom, but some departments are also offering just virtual meetups. I think we're used to having a break room or a place to share food or snacks together. So we're really encouraging, coworkers to consider ways that they can meet up outside of the work environment, if that feels comfortable, right, and appropriate. The last website I'd like to bring people's attention to that is a really beautiful and well-created resource is the Greater Goods Guide to Wellbeing. The Greater Good Science Center is a portion of UC Berkeley, and what they do is focus on empiric and science-driven ways of maintaining health and well-being. So it's based in positive, often psychology, but they have an entire portion of their website now devoted to managing, supporting health and well-being during COVID-19. So again, that's going to be included on that resource sheet so that you can peruse it. It includes things for parents, for educators, for individuals, for groups. It's a really fantastic first place to start if you're just not sure how to get support. Next slide, please. So I've been talking about developing an individual self-care plan, and I've made some recommendations, and we are giving out an actual sheet for you to complete if you feel so moved. But the recommendations I'm going to re-emphasize are really develop a plan during times of less stress. And I'm not saying that ironically. I mean, as least stressed as you could possibly be when you make it, the more likely the plan is to meet your need and not your current reaction. So this means including others in your home and community. If you live with a partner or housemates, it's always nice to make plans with them in mind, and ideally with them in the room. It can also reduce the amount of confusion and resentment that can crop up in close quarters. The second portion of this is creating a diverse portfolio, meaning that you're really expanding the way that your plan is meeting your needs. So the way we set it up was to make sure you have some emotional needs met, some practical needs met, so individual, community, and then concrete and emotional needs. So you're not just focusing on one aspect of your life, like work or home. I do think it's important that you can alter your plan as needed. I think all of us have gotten pretty good at the adaptation of our lives, but that's also why a diverse portfolio of support is really important, because it means if you're not able to connect with one friend, that you've got another opportunity out there, that you're making sure that you've got balance and options should some things fall through while you're trying to take care of yourself. This really brings me to the end of our portion of this training that talks about specifics. I cannot say how much I appreciate all of you taking the time, not just to be here with your community, although virtually, but to really prioritize, as Dr. Buckner said, your health and well-being in the middle of a workday. Again, I think it speaks true volumes to how this department feels about you and ideally about each other. So I appreciate you all being here with me. Thank you. I'm going to turn this back to Dr. Parker to start our next portion, which is the question and answer portion.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I think Daniel, I think you were going to let us know what questions have come through so that Dr. Buckner and Dr. Allenson and I can answer some of them.
Absolutely. Well, I have two questions for all of you that have come up as we sorted them out. The first one is, actually, let me just say, there's one question. Let me start over, and we already know the answer, and that is, this presentation absolutely is being recorded, and all the materials that you viewed so far during this presentation will in fact be distributed following this webinar. So thank you for asking. But an important question, and another important question that came up is, are there any highly recommended UCSF resources that you feel are somewhat underutilized or that are often overlooked by our community?
So UCSF resources.
That's correct.
Well, Dr. Allenson mentioned quite a number of them, and I think that there certainly are more. A lot of it depends on what kind of support someone might be looking for. For example, if you are yourself in a caregiving role or profession, physician, nurse, technician, etc., the Caring for the Caregivers program is an excellent resource for people in those roles. That means that you can get peer support, you can get group support if you're part of a group that needs that kind of help, and so on. So that's one that I would certainly emphasize. And then the spiritual care group, they provide a wide variety of support for people individually and group-wise. They do things like debriefings, for groups that have gone through some kind of tragic event. FSAP does that too, I might add. Any other things to add, Dr. Buckner?
No, I think those are really important highlights, so thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Another question that came up for the panel is, do employees need to go through their own health insurance plan, or do these services that you've mentioned during your presentation?
Well, certainly if they're looking for individual therapy, for example, they have the option of going to their own insurance plan if they'd rather, like maybe if they need a more specialized type of care or someone who they can see after hours or weekends. That's certainly something that FSAP can help them with. If they are looking for help that they can access during the work week, then certainly FSAP is ready and available to help them. We can deal with both urgent and non-urgent requests.
That's fantastic.
And I should mention those services are free and strictly confidential.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And of course, for employees, if your designated health plan with UCSF offers, most of them do offer counseling services, you can also feel free to utilize those as well. But these services, as Dr. Parker has mentioned, are free of cost to our employees, to our community. Very good. Well, at this time, I want to be very mindful of the amount of time we have left. If there are more questions that happen to come through, we will capture them and send them out separately so that everybody has an opportunity to ask questions that may come up after the webinar. I'm going to take this time to turn it over to Dr. Buckner and ask him to provide us all with his closing remarks.
I think it's coming my way. So I just want to thank, first and foremost, our featured speakers, Dr. Allenson and Dr. Parker. This was a really incredible session, jam-packed with so much information. I was sort of screenshotting things as we went, just because I some of it really stuck out to me as interesting ways of conceptualizing how to approach our emotional health in these circumstances. So thank you so much for taking the time to give this presentation to our department. I want to thank all of the attendees in the radiology department who participated. I think at our maximum, we were upwards around 115 or 120 folks on the webinar. So it's just great to be with all of you, if only virtually. And again, want to emphasize that we're recording this, and we'll make a link to the recording available to all of you. And we'll also be sending out some of the more specific resources that were mentioned over the course of the talk. Please share that widely with others in the department and the community at large. I think these are really invaluable resources for all of us. Besides that, just please take care of yourselves and stay well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.